wherever you are in the world. Thank you so very much for joining us in our Fielding Global Democracy and Human Rights Initiative, Democracy in Action, Your Role in Shaping Our Future. My name is Allison Davis Whiteeyes, and I currently serve as the interim provost and senior vice president for Fielding Graduate University. And we, the participants of today's event, are just pleased to see so many people who actually care about democracy joining us today. As part of our commitment to increasing dialogue and deepening our understanding of the democratic principles of our community, we plan on hosting a series of these events. I think we can all agree that democracy is not a spectator sport. It requires work, the ability to challenge ideas, and at the same time, find common ground on those issues that matter. Today, more than ever, we find ourselves in a polarized world where partisan thinking is the norm rather than the exception. And our hope is that these dialogues will bring us together as a community across our political divides to engage in transpartisan conversations that transcend our differences while still acknowledging them, and at the same time building towards a post-partisan future where we address the issues that matter to us all. With that in mind, please allow me to introduce to you today the moderator and facilitator for today's event, Dr. Philip Kneis, who serves as our Fielding Fellow for our Global Democracy and Human Rights Initiative. Please join me in welcoming Dr. Philip Kneis.
Thank you, Provost Davis Whiteeyes. I will be emceeing this event. I teach at Oregon State University and the University of Tübingen. I'm here also as the Fielding Faculty Fellow charged with organizing these events. And for this panel, I'll just run us all through the show and maybe contextualize a little bit why we are here. We are seeing that democracy seems to be experiencing a global crisis. Citizens participate less and prefer to become consumers of politics rather than its active shapers. Free speech is under threat, and a common public sphere, so necessary for any democracy, is very difficult to find. Our technological advances are spreading information just as much as disinformation and misinformation, and social niceties seem to be out the door on so-called social media. In a world of increased stress and challenges, how can we even think about shaping our world and our lives with confidence, courage, conviction, and compassion? How do we trust each other when trust is so difficult to achieve nowadays? This is the second in a series of panels on global democracy and human rights. We aim to create an atmosphere of mutual appreciation and respect, especially for our differences, not in spite of them, but because of them. We want to have dialogue, we want to listen, we want to engage, we want to invite each of you to be active citizens. We aim to create a non-partisan space for political conversation. We also recognize that this is a global phenomenon. So in the first hour, you will hear from a panel of presenters affiliated with Fielding Graduate University. And in the second hour, we will hold a space for dialogue and small group dialogue. Thank you all for coming and welcome. I will now invite our first speakers, Dr. Keith Melville, faculty member at Fielding, and Dr. John Dedrick, Chief Operating Officer at the Kettering Foundation. They will speak about the role of citizens and civic institutions in a democratic framework.
Thank you, Philip, and thank you, Allison, for organizing this series. And as you said, it couldn't be a more important moment to do that. Many of us, it's so good to be with you all. A number of us have been a part of previous conversations last October in this series. Some of us were together late in January, just after the inauguration. But what a moment this is. I find myself, maybe you do as well, both binging on news and waking up at 4 a.m, wondering what's going on and what I can do about it, what we can do about it together. So what John and I would like to do, just to kick off this 2-hour discussion, is to ask some basic questions to help to frame the conversation. So let's start with this. In the first place, we're a scholar practitioner community. We honor clear thinking, we honor well-informed conversations and well-informed participation. So we are both those things. We're scholars and we are involved in action. And I think that pretty well frames what we're trying to do here, both to understand better what the nature of the crisis is, and then on the basis of that to say, okay, what should we do, both individually and collectively? So let's start with this. The first question, the basic question is there a crisis in democracy? Most of the American public agrees and has agreed for some time that that's the case. Individuals of both parties agree there is a crisis. Democracy is disintegrating, is eroding in important ways. So what we want to talk about is both to help clarify in the next couple of minutes, what's the nature of that crisis? And in particular, what strikes me is how clear the calls are among the major commentators now about the danger that we face. I was looking just the other day at the recent issue of Foreign Affairs magazine. I mean, many of you are familiar with Foreign Affairs. It's a kind of elite and centrist publication. Well, here the chief article in the current issue is by Stephen Levitsky and Lucan Way, and it's called The Path to American Authoritarianism. And here's one sentence from that account. Democracy is in greater peril today than at any time in modern US history. In greater peril than at any time in modern US history. So we're at an inflection point. That is where the discussion starts. So as I say, let's move to understanding what the nature of the crisis is, and in particular, what's the antithesis of democracy? What is this thing called autocracy that wasn't discussed in most of the civics classes that we all attended years back? So we have just a couple of minutes. I don't want to be non-winded right here in the introduction. Why don't we move, John, to the couple of slides that you put together and look more closely at the nature of and the symptoms of authoritarianism. And then we'll be focusing on one particular aspect of the threat to civil institutions, which hasn't gotten all that much attention. And then we want to move very briefly to preview the discussion that we'll be getting into in more depth later on. And that is, what can we do as citizens to respond to the current crisis? So with that, John, let me pass it over to you, and let's take a look at the slides here about autocracy.
You got it. Thank you all. It's really, really terrific to be part of this conversation. And Provost White Eyes and Dr. Knies, thank you so much for organizing this space within Fielding community. It's couldn't be a more timely conversation. Provost White Eyes said in her opening remarks, quote, democracy is not a spectator sport. And to emphasize something that Keith has highlighted again, I think we can think about issues over which we can have reasonable, even if they're deeply felt disagreements. How much immigration can the country handle, for example? And then there are issues that relate to the basic functioning of the democratic process itself, the institutions by which we are represented, our votes, the peaceful transfer of power, basic adherence to rule of law. And we're living at a moment when some people, and as Keith has indicated in polling data, large numbers of people would say, we're not just dealing with issues over which reasonable people can disagree. We're dealing with something very fundamental in the structure of democracy itself. And what may be at risk many people would argue, is the potential for an autocracy or authoritarian takeover in the United States and other countries. So what would we be looking for if we were expecting a rise of authoritarianism? So the next two slides come from a group called Protect Democracy. I think they're largely generic. They are prepared by Protect Democracy, but could have been prepared by other groups. We see people who are going to be authoritarians trying to politicize independent institutions, and that's what I'm going to focus on in just a couple minutes. Spreading disinformation, trying to expand executive power at the expense of checks and balances, squashing criticism and dissent, targeting vulnerable and marginalized groups. Here I would look especially at questions around both legal strategies and narrative strategies, try to corrupt elections, and sometimes stoke violence. So this chart, which Keith and I used also on January 23rd with some of you on this call, when authoritarians are starting to take over institutions, what are the kinds of things we see? We tend to see pardon to license lawbreaking, and we could point to the pardoning of the January 6th insurrectionists. We see investigations against critics and rivals. We see regulations that are retaliatory, and I'll come back to that. We see overreach of law enforcement, which we're seeing in some cities, in immigration and other areas. We see the domestic deployment of the military. We could look to the southern border. We see refusal to leave office. So these are the kinds of things that people would say if we're looking at an autocracy we might see. I want to talk next for just very briefly about civil society institutions, which was indicated on the program. When Senator Bill Bradley was in office, he used to use the image of a three-legged stool in American democracy: our government, our civil society, and our market economy. And that the functioning of democracy depended on the strength of all three parts of the society: strength of our government, strength of our civil society, and the strength of our market institutions. No need to get into this definition in general. It is, I think, a good summary definition by George Ingram at Brookings. There are others, but what we're typically talking about with civil society are those institutions outside of government that serve some kind of public interest or benefit, that are in some ways independent of market incentives and independent of government control, where, in the language of French sociologist Alexis de Tocqueville, people learn the arts of association, form public will, and act. Think of our schools and universities, our free press, community groups, faith groups, cultural groups, and of course, a large number of just traditional charitable welfare and relief groups. In the US context, if we look at our civil society organizations and its relationship to government and the market, what we see in all states is a very large dependence on both market and government revenues. The Urban Institute, which I think is a very good resource to look at for data on the nonprofit sector, has a new nonprofit tracking tool available. I urge you to look at it if you're interested. And the point of this particular chart is to emphasize that if there are changes in public policy, for example, freezing of funds or other changes that reduce revenues, the risk to not having a balanced budget for many, many nonprofits in all our states is significant, anywhere between 60 and 80%, depending on what state you're in. So the point of the chart, very briefly, is to emphasize the relationship between of the three legs of the stools: the state, government, and civil society. Since the January 21st, according to the National Council on Nonprofits, at least 31 executive orders have been released, which directly affect the operations of nonprofit organizations across a broad range of issues. We won't go into the details here, but I do want to highlight just three of them because they've gotten a lot of attention and relate directly to the strength of our civil society. First, one of the first executive orders released dealt with diversity, equity, and inclusion programs in both the public and private sectors. And in the public and in the private sector, one section of that act, and I would recommend reading it, calls for the heads of all the agencies to identify up to 9 publicly traded companies, universities with significant endowments, foundations with significant endowments, or major nonprofit organizations or professional associations for investigation on their compliance with the act. This is kind of a direct chilling, potentially direct chilling effect for nonprofit organizations. Just last week, there was an executive order relating to public student loan forgiveness programs. And while it's unclear how that will play out in the immediate term, students who have used public service, either in government or nonprofit organizations, to reduce student debt, may be at risk in a number of policy areas, including LGBT plus serving organizations and immigrant serving organizations. Again, at minimally a significant chilling effect on these organizations. And then finally, right in the middle of this chart, a very broad executive order, which I'm going to put on the screen because it is brief and gives a sense of the tone of the kinds of issues that nonprofits and civil society are going to deal with. Again, to the extent that we're dependent in many ways on government funding for many of our NGOs, this act calls on the federal government to review at minimum its funding of all NGOs. And with that, Keith, I'll turn it back to you.
Thank you, John. So just to summarize so far, what we're trying to do is to be clear about what's at risk. What's been featured in the media is that what's at risk are the government agencies that are being cut back and the arbitrary power by non-elected officials. That's what obviously a lot of the protests have been about. But what's at risk is a good deal more than that. It's not just about the long-term concentration of executive power. It's also, as John has been laying out here, the risk to this whole nonprofit sector, which tends not to get much media attention, but is hugely influential and far larger and far more involved in pro-democracy efforts. So that the contingency of the nonprofit sector is something we really need to keep an eye on in terms of what we can do, in addition to pushing back against Musk, in addition to pushing back against the obvious indications of movement toward that authoritarian profile, John, that you were talking about. So let me segue then to just a very brief preview. I'm aware that we're about out of our collective time here, Philip. Very brief preview of what we can offer later on regarding what citizens can do. That's a very underappreciated question. A lot of people are asking it, but there are very few detailed or useful responses to that question that really lay out, given the various threats that face us as a nation and face us as communities and as individuals. What can we do exactly beyond the obvious things like voting or participating in rallies. And that's been a project that John and I have been working on for some time. And later on in the breakout room, we'll talk more about something we've been developing, which is a 4-quadrant way of thinking about what I can do, what you can do, what we can do as citizens in order to address each of the 4 major threats to democracy. So for now, I think that's probably enough as a preview. Philip, I'll hand it back to you and we'll pass the baton here.
Thank you, Keith. And again, as a reminder, we'll have an hour later for dialogue. Also, this is meant as a teaser also for later panels. In later months, we will have more space to talk about democracy, civil society in more detail. So if you're thinking, missing something here, maybe it'll come. So now we will hear from Dr. Laura Black, also faculty member at Fielding, who will address questions of dialogue and democratic discourse.
Thank you all. I am honored to be part of this and especially appreciate going after Keith and John, because a lot of what I'm going to say kind of complements and builds on and extends the foundation that they've been laying for us. So I'm going to share a few slides because I like to use kind of visual images when I'm doing these presentations. So when I start workshops about this kind of thing, I often begin with a question for people who are in the room, and we're not going to talk about it right now because I only have 8 minutes, but just as a preview, I often ask, how do you talk about politics? And ask these questions: who are you talking to? Where are you? What's your goal? What's your conversation like? How are you feeling? Or if you can't answer any of those questions because talking about politics is terrible and scary and awful and you never do it, then why? And giving people some time to sort of process this on their own and engage in conversation with folks around them about this, inevitably I see some trends that mirror what we see in research in political conversation. And this has been true over the years, but is especially heightened right now. So we see, in political communication research, we see that folks, we're typically talking to people who we feel connection to, we have an affinity with. So we tend to talk to people who are like us, maybe family or friends who share our views. And this serves an important purpose for us, but this is something that is fairly common. When we're talking with someone who we perceive as different, who we disagree with, and this is the kind of stuff that John was mentioning about, there's lots of reasonable things to disagree about, but our communication goals are often to persuade. We're trying to share our perspective is mostly what we're trying to do, and try to get other people to understand us and maybe to change their mind and see why we're right. Opinions tend to be pretty kind of polarized. Issues are treated as sort of two-sided, and opinion change is pretty rare in the sort of political conversation. And this is, I think, really problematic for us as a society. I'm thinking largely of research within the US, although this, I'm sure there's cultural variation on these things. But just a couple looks at the slides, or some snapshots about how we feel about each other, how we feel about communicating with others in about politics. So since this is drawing on research from the Pew Research Foundation, we can see it's hard for us to talk about politics. We don't trust each other. We have some pretty big stereotypes about one another. We get our news from different places, right? So we tend to think the other side is kind of closed-minded, dishonest, dumb, and immoral, which I think is really unfortunate, right? So naturally, it's stressful to talk to each other about politics when we see folks here sort of trends since 2016 about what it's like for people when they're talking about politics with people they disagree with. It's okay that it's stressful if we were to trust our institutions to work for us, but as we've seen, we're not trusting our institutions. We don't trust our government. The public trust in government is near historic lows, was at a historic low in 2022. And I think, we can see even changes since that time. Fewer Americans see common ground between parties as even possible. So this leads us to thinking about when we talk about politics, we talk about issues that should matter to us. People feel exhausted and angry, and it leads to dinner conversations kind of like this one, which of course is a humorous or comic kind of look at it. But the idea that we need some sort of referee or structure to even talk about issues that matter to our lives. But here's where I see there is potential. I see potential in the sense that people are less stressed about talking about politics and political issues with people they disagree with if they see that they have something else in common with that person. So even when we disagree, we can find at least some ability to engage. And here's where I think on our local efforts, with our family, with our friends, within our communities, that we should focus some of our attention. Here's where I'm kind of thinking about when we see people as connected to us in some way. And there's lots of social psychology to sort of support this idea of sort of in-group and out-group and social identity and things like this. So the big thing that I want to highlight is the potential of fostering community and connection and dialogue, not to completely change things on a structural level, but to get us to a point where we can trust each other at least a little bit, and we can work together and see potential for commonality. It's not going to change everything, but with all of the challenges to our institutions, those challenges and the rise of authoritarianism benefits from a public who is afraid, who can't trust anybody, who disengages and doesn't see connection and sees people who disagree with as the enemy. So if I want to think about how do we deal with that sort of issue? So first, I think looking for opportunities to build community and help meet people's basic needs. I spend a lot of my time, I've lived for the past several years in Appalachian, Ohio, and it's a profoundly polarized place politically, but there are common needs that people have. So some of these organizations, like John was talking about, the sort of civic the sort of mutual aid societies and NGOs are being threatened, and people's needs are getting higher, right? So people helping to find spaces where we can participate, that is important. And then collaboratively creating a framework for engagement. I think a lot of folks like me, when we say, oh, well, we need to engage in dialogue, we kind of come in with this model of what dialogue might look like, and we try to kind of plump it onto a group of people and say, here, we're going to engage in dialogue. But without that sort of buy-in at the beginning and sort of mutual understanding of desire to talk and sort of seeing why it might be helpful or matter for us, then we need to engage in that collaboratively. Thinking about some of the things we would know about managing conflict mediators, right? You would have a structure that emphasizes focusing on issues and thinking about how issues influence people, practicing this sort of deep listening and engaging, asking questions of genuine curiosity, and it's simultaneously sharing lived experience and perspective. And we're going to have some opportunity to practice this in a bit. And then also, of course, we can talk more about it at future sessions. But I just want to give you a couple of quick examples, and then I'll close by talking about what dialogue is not. So there are a number of organizations that produce or kind of promote this kind of community engagement. And these are a couple that are in sort of rural environments. Indivisible Appalachian, it's a social welfare organization, but they also do education and advocacy. Same thing with Rural Organizing and Resilience. This is a fairly progressive politically organization, but a lot of the work that they do is on helping people in Western North Carolina after natural disasters and things like that. There are a number of organizations that also promote dialogue, and if you find yourself wanting to engage in this kind of work and you're not sure where to start, there are lots of places that you can sort of look to for resources. And then finally, just thinking about what is dialogue and what isn't dialogue. I would say dialogue is not just being civil. It's not just like holding our tongue, it's actually engaging. It's not just rehashing kind of partisan sound bites and talking points. It also doesn't mean giving up our beliefs and values or giving equal airtime and sort of uncritically accepting kind of harmful and false equivalents of sort of harmful views, right? It's much more nuanced than that. It does involve recognizing humanity and working toward understanding. It requires commitment. It needs to be voluntary, and it can be part of a larger social change effort. But I also would say it's not able to solve all the problems, but it is able to help us with some of the things to on our local level and with our relationships. So that was 1 minute over, Philip, but I look forward to engaging more with these ideas in our small group breakouts and then in future conversations.
Thank you. I assumed people will be approximately holding their time. Thank you very much. Thank you for stressing the necessity for dialogue and the curiosity for each other. One of my mentors early in life told me, isn't it fantastic that we are all different? Life would be so boring if we were all the same. It's stressful, but we need to listen because we cannot just take in our own position all the time. I put into the link, into the chat, a shameless advertisement for our climate dialogue group. We have some of the members here. So if you want to see a Bohmian-inspired dialogue happening, we are having meetings roughly every 2 weeks. And so please contact John Ruffin or even myself if you want to be part of that. Next, we'll hear from Dr. Laurence Habib, faculty member at Oslo Met, and also a faculty fellow at Fielding, for her thoughts on technology and democracy.
Thank you so much, Philip, for having me here. Thanks to all of you for inviting me. I would like first to thank Provost Whiteyes, who said so tellingly that democracy is not a spectator sport. And I would underline that technology is definitely not a spectator sport. We have to start thinking about technology not just as a tool. We are not just users as this tool. We are part of a gigantic global experiment where each time we are using this tool, we are shaping the technology, and we are participating in this shaping of technology, all of us globally, and this global technology is shaping us and our opinions. I think it's really important to think about this particular artifact. And the reason for that is that the scientific investigation of AI, of artificial intelligence, and the scientific investigation of democracy have tended to be two discrete, very different scholarly pursuits. We are just starting to see new research about AI and democracy. And I'm so glad that I found a few articles about it. And I would like to, for you to have a look at this particular one from 2023, because it has a very important message. Sarah Krebs and Doug Kreiner. And they say that the threats to democracy coming from AI, they're not just democratic representation. They're also democratic accountability. And worst of all, democratic trust, because when you do not know what to believe, then you're going to distrust the entire information ecosystem. And that's where it's so easy to grow authoritarianism, when you don't believe anything. Just to give you one report, there's several reports that are coming out right now about what's happening with those new large language models. But I would like to applaud what Google is doing, because they are being honest about the dangers of the very technology that they are developing. This report came out 29th of January 2025. And as John and Keith talked about, the spreading of disinformation is real, and it's also becoming more and more relevant because of this technology. Here, Google talks about APT and information operations, and I would like especially to look at those information operations. Some examples are sock puppet accounts and comment brigading. Let's start with brigading. It's a coordinated attack by a group, and that has always happened. The problem now is that it's so much more easy to create for social media users, but those coordinated attacks can be it can be a multitude of users that are created by AI. And then all the problematic behavior like downvoting, redirecting audiences to other matters, that gets compounded. The other thing that we talk about in this report is sock puppets. I'm sure many of you know about the topic of sock puppets. What I didn't know before I read this report is that what is called ballot stuffing sock puppets, like creating multiple identities to boost what should be seen as a majority opinion, but is not actually the majority opinion, is not the latest attacks. The latest attacks are what's called straw man sock puppets, where a sock puppet typically behaves in an uninformed and bigoted manner in order to discredit everyone else who has those perspectives. I think we're going to talk a lot more about it in the breakout rooms, but before I close, I would like to talk about concern trolls. That's another type of problematic behavior powered by AI, because it's so much easier to use language to act sympathetic, but at the same time undermine an idea or a discussion. So you pretend to support something, and then you start asking questions. And AI is really good at that if you want to use it for manipulation. So I would like to finish with this question: can democracy survive the disruptive power of AI? I hope that we can have a good conversation about that in the breakout rooms. And I'll stop sharing. Thanks.
Thank you, Laurence. And we will have an upcoming panel in the next month specifically on the question of technology and democracy, because there's so much more we can get into. And it is very new to all of us and probably disconcerting. Thank you. But there always remains hope. So we've heard a lot of disconcerting things right now. I would again stress what we need still is energy, and energy can only be created through hope. And hope is something we can choose to have in spite of everything. So with that, I'd like to invite Dr. Frederick Steyer, also faculty member at Fielding, for some remarks on what this all matters in a global context, because you're talking about global democracy.
Yeah. Well, thanks. Yeah, thanks so much, Philip. And I hope that I'm not adding to the stress of the conversation in the day, but I would like to, since I'm one of the later speakers in the group, I saw my role as also trying to make connections along the lines of the bridge building that several have mentioned among the previous speakers, but also set up ideas to come. And with Laurence, with your talk, one of the things that strikes me is new words that allow for new ways of being in the world, and how they allow for new forms of social relationships through technology that you might say, on the one hand, could be at the heart of democracy, on the other hand, threaten the very democracy that we're talking about. One of the ideas that I wanted to talk about is how things, how we develop relationships around words and how language affords different ways of being in the world, and how that shows up in terms of global democracy. So I was thinking, and this is based on Keith and John's presentation earlier, that somehow it's come to be that the very idea of being nonpartisan is itself a partisan position. And you wonder, how could that actually be? There's almost this sort of meta level, although the word meta has been now co-opted, so I'm hesitant to use it, sorry, even though I just did. Thinking about what is our discourse about discourse, and what is the role of discourse, as Allison has so graciously done in terms of inviting us to raise the level of discourse, to think about how we actually are with each other. My background is in systems ideas, so systemic, by the way, is one of the words. I don't know how many people have seen the New York Times 2 days ago published a list of words that are now banned in government documents. And you'd be amazed if you take a look at that, how many of the things that we value and cherish at Fielding are on that list. So it's not like we're in a competition to see how many words we can use, but it turns out the word systemic is actually on that list, in addition to ones that you might expect. But from a systems point of view, one big idea that I wanted to share and just lay out there is the importance of the idea of unity in diversity. Okay, unity in diversity. It's not something that's a new term. It goes back to indigenous groups, had that at the heart of their ways of being in the world. Sufi doctrines talk about the importance of unity and diversity using different words. And it's also the motto of the European Union. And you think about it, and the importance of allowing for difference and valuing difference at the same time coming together. And how this often gets misheard is that somehow unity is heard as the same as uniformity and a request for sameness. And that's not what's going on. It really is valuing difference and a statement about relationships. Unity is a statement about how we relate to each other and how we come together while valuing what's different. What becomes important for this, just building on what Laura was saying, is how we want to be in dialogue with each other. And here, I know Philip mentioned the Climate Dialogue Group, which uses David Bohm's work very much. And a related way of being in dialogue is that of Martin Buber. And Buber, who is so wonderful at using metaphors, talks about the importance of the narrow ridge, which presents a kind of paradox if you use traditional Western logic, in the sense of what he was inviting us to do was to appreciate the perspective of someone else and hold to that while also holding to your opinion. And the idea of the narrow ridge is a physical metaphor of if you move too much one way or the other, you fall down. So how do you create this balance of valuing other people's opinions that are markedly different than your own, and yet holding on to your opinion? And it requires a kind of both and logic, not an either or logic, which is also at the heart of unity and diversity. The other thing that I wanted to stress here is that diversity itself is a very plastic term, and it needs to be. That we need to recognize that, especially in global discourse, there are many different ways of understanding what diversity means and how different something can be before it's sort of beyond the bounds. And how do we actually recognize that and find ways? It's almost as though we have to appreciate, as with Buber's narrow ridge, a kind of paradox that we have to somehow have some trust that we are all in the same frame, the same conversation of valuing difference, at the same time, not trusting at the same time, being open to recognize that, maybe we didn't mean the same thing by diversity. And maybe we need to explore diverse ways of understanding diversity. And this, in the global scene, this becomes so important in terms of how we think about language, how we think about communication, and really stressing what are the consequences. And this is why, Allison, your idea of not a spectator sport, actively engaging around what unity and diversity might mean. Much more to speak about there, but we can save that for the breakout groups. Thanks.
Thank you, Fred. I see a trend of self-limiting the already sparse time that was given. Thank you, but that gives us all more space to talk about it later. So finally, when it comes to presentations, I would like to invite Fielding student Yazik Drayden, who will share some ideas on democracy, trust in government, and propaganda.
Greetings. Can everyone hear me okay? All right, indeed. I'd like to thank the panel for having me and having the opportunity to present to everyone today. So let me go ahead and share my screen. Let me see here. Let's see, are we live? Got it?
You're live.
All right, excellent, excellent. All right, so what I'm going to do here is look to try to compress some information here within this short period of time to express some ideas and kind of assemble a quick collage for future dialogues and interactions with one another. So right here, what we can see is I have some quick slides for democracy. And let me make sure we do it like this. Let's check it out. Okay, boom. Okay, so this actually right here is the definition of democracy as it is written in the Funk and Wagnall's Collegiate Dictionary of 1947. I will get to why it is that I chose this dictionary from 1947 in a couple of moments here. So some of the key elements of this definition that I want to outline is basically it's a theory in government, which in its purest form, it talks about the people sharing equally in privileges, duties, and responsibilities. And also, I want to highlight right here, if you can see my cursor moving, it says each participating in person in the government. So it talks about participation, which echoes and reflects what it is that Dr. Davis White-Eyes mentioned earlier as far as democracy is not supposed to be a spectator sport, right? So we'll go ahead and let's bookmark that about it requires participating by everyone. Let me make sure I make the right slide move. There we go. So I would like to paint the picture of how it is that we got here. Some may be familiar with the term modernism or modernity, which basically reflects the period from the 17th century up until present moment. Now, this right here happens to be a definition that's found in the APA Dictionary of Psychology. So I would consider that a nice authoritative source of information here. And also modernism is also associated with the Enlightenment, which put briefly is basically an epistemological practice which talks about objectivity, relies on objectivity, and talks about the or deals with and explores universality and also the whole construct of objective truth, that such thing called objective truth actually exists and things that are actually knowable. So that means an individual being able to go beyond one's own opinion and to see that which is actually objective. Now, this is actually taken from one of the textbooks here at Fielding that's in the history of psychology course, Pickering and Rutherford. So let's go to the next level. So we have modernity, which is associated with being able to observe or identify that which is objective truth, which immediately ties to science. Oh, and also I wanted to talk about another important definition or meaning here is that basically modern psychology exists because of this particular phase in history or this particular era. Okay, so what is postmodernism then, right? So postmodernism is also discussed in the APA Dictionary of Psychology, correct? So basically, postmodernism rejects the idea of an objective truth and says that such a construct can't even exist, right? So postmodernists, they see the ideal of objective truth as being a guiding principle of science and the things of that nature is basically flawed. So they don't see that that's even possible, more so that there can be no such truth, excuse me, and that only a plurality of narratives and perspectives. So the postmodernist approach to objective truth is that saying that it does not exist. What I meant to talk about is a postmodernist approach to language. They see language as only a collective construct that only has collective validity, right? To whereas the Enlightenment modernist approach sees language as a means from humans to communicate from one person to another to actually be able to describe that which is actually objective reality. So you can see an argument can be made that postmodernism is actually antithetical to the whole very idea of science, right? So there's a reason, like I said, we're going to tie this all in together in part right now. That's one of the reasons why I used the older dictionary from Funk and Wagnalls from 1947 to show more of the original definition of what the word means instead of any version that could be modernly produced that would seek to try to change the definition of what a word such as democracy or a construct such as democracy actually means. So moving forward, we're going to keep tying this in. So this gentleman right here by the name of Edward Bernays, some of you may or may not heard about him. Actually, through the process of working on this presentation and another one, I just got this book called Propaganda. This is, I believe it was 1928, if memory serves me correctly, when he first produced this book. It just came yesterday, so I haven't had a chance to dig too deep up into it, but I am already aware of him. So Edward Bernays happens to be the biological nephew of Sigmund Freud. Some of you may have heard of him, Sigmund Freud, right? And so what's interesting about Edward Bernays, let me let his words speak for himself, because he's not just a random inert or inert person throughout history. And so basically what he says here is, here's a quote from Edward Bernays: the conscious and intelligent manipulation of the organized habits and opinions of the masses is an important element in democratic society. Those who manipulate this unseen mechanism of society constitute an invisible government, which is the true ruling power of our country. Edward Bernays. Now, when working on a past research project where I was talking about pop culture and its influence on the population, I end up talking about Edward Bernays because he's also known as the father of PR, which is public relations, and a publication associated with the APA wrote an article because I wanted to verify that he was Sigmund Freud's nephew, and they actually verified that. So right here, Edward Bernays is also associated, according to that article in the APA, he's associated with making bacon and eggs, the all-American breakfast, right? And also, Edward Bernays also worked on trying to eliminate the taboo of women smoking in public, because there used to be a time frame to where women smoking in public was seen in a very, very negative light, and then certain preconceived notions were perceived about any woman that was smoking in public. So he was a part of creating these different campaigns to influence people's behavior. And also in this article that was produced by the publication associated with the APA, it shows that he wrote a letter to his uncle saying, like, hey, I've used what I've learned from you to manipulate public opinion and manipulate people's opinions and things of that nature without them even knowing it. And so he was thanking him for that. So it's well established. And he also worked with some government entities as well. And also in this book, it talks about how he was a part of getting the public to accept World War I and basically manipulating people's opinions about wars and other issues. So then we start talking about the Overton window, but let's move on for the sake of time. Let me see. Like I said, trying to compress it all. So anyway, in conclusion, I'm gonna go ahead and wrap it up. So as for solution purposes and something that could possibly being done as a result of the research I was doing for this, yes, I've had an understanding of what it means to be intellectually honest for myself over the years, but I just started to look it up, and I started finding some interesting literature actually last night as far as what does the literature say. So I'm going to dig more deeper into it. But what's interesting here is some of you may have heard of Psychology Today, right? So I thought it was interesting here that this is an article written mid-January, let's say, and it says, in a world awash in propaganda, at a time when style matters more than actual substance, intellectual honesty has never been so much more important. Now, I know this isn't necessarily a quote. I'm going to find out where they got this from, because I did grab this from Wikipedia here about some bullet points on what it is to be intellectual honesty. I find these definitions valid and I will get the original sources later. But basically, what they have here is one's personal beliefs or politics do not interfere with the pursuit of truth. That's one point. Relevant facts and information are not purposefully omitted, even when such things may contradict one's own hypothesis. So, as you see here, there is a correlation between the whole construct of modernism, postmodernism, and then in order to be able to overcome propaganda and being able to be perhaps influenced by individuals or institutions who do not have the best interests of humanity in mind, through science, through understanding what is objective truth and being intellectually honest, I think that is a means to where we could build bridges between one another and communicate. That way we can move forward to building a more prosperous future. So that's kind of compressed that in there. And then I'm gonna go ahead and press the pause button. I don't want to go too much over time. And then, so from there, I will say thank you. And then my references, boom, right there, just in case anybody would like to check that out. Thanks again.
Thank you, Yazik. And I think a miracle just happened. We are actually on time. And this never happens. Thank you, everybody. Now we'll have some time for some direct questions before we move into breakout rooms. Yazik, I think it is